You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 64. Over the next few weeks, Karyne didn't take a single step outside his room without the company of the guards. He recognized them as two of Enla's, the handsome kind who were meant to make her look good, even though they were also trustworthy to their core. Still, they were faithful to Enla, and instead of their presence putting him at ease for his safety, they made him wary of his own sister. Despite spending most of their time in bed, his parents made time to lecture Karyne over his impropriety, emphasizing that the safest thing for the people was to foster peace between nations, as if Mavis's new nation had always been something to consider during their reign. The days blended together as Karyne was forced to attend council meetings and put on a smile for visitors from the south. Any news from the east came with gifts from the new monarch, while Karyne heard no more mention of Durakan or Islara. What use was being a prince if he had no power? A knock sounded on his door, pulling him from his stupor at his bedroom window. Clothes and books had lain scattered across the floor ever since he'd started refusing to let the maids in his room. The pillows on his bed formed a miniature Mount Viscano, blocking his view of the door. The knock came again, signifying that it wasn't Enla who would have barged in by now. "Come in," he called, turning back to the window, eyeing the statue of Queen Amaya, swearing her eyes held judgment as they looked up to his. The door scraped open. "You have a visitor," one of the guards announced. Karyne frowned. Who would be visiting him? He supposed it could be Lenda. She'd come a few times at Enla's request to keep the people from growing suspicious. With her handmaiden's watchful eyes and listening ears, Karyne hadn't been able to ask Lenda about Enla's plan for their bond. Besides, what good would it do? At least the guards hadn't caught Daisy's group. They were likely halfway to Mindron by now, riding along the northern sea's coast. His heart swelled at the thought of being near the open water, dining on fresh fish. "Prince Karyne?" The guard spoke again, drawing Karyne's gaze from the window. "Oh, right, a visitor. Who is it?" "I believe he's your first mate." The guard's gaze shifted uneasily. He wouldn't give us his name. He growled, after which he said something to the effect of who else would show up for the boy. The hint of a smile tugged at Karyne's lips. "He has tattoos on his arms as well as his shaven head." "He's bald," Karyne corrected. "And send him in." The door burst open before the words had finished leaving Karyne's lips. The guard tensed, reaching for his sword. "I have hair where it matters." Larkos patted his chest. He stopped just inside the room, looking around in disgust. "Never would have guessed you lived in a hovel after all the times you've made Breve swab the deck." "He's fine," Karyne said, waving the guard away before pulling a chair from his desk and offering it to Larkos with a flourish. "I thought that if I let it get bad enough, Enla might decide I'm mentally unstable without time at sea." Larkos squinted after the guard, waiting until the door latched. "Are you in trouble?" he whispered. No more than usual. When Larkos remained standing, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, Karyne shrugged and sat in the chair, propping his bare feet up on the desk. "How did you get all the way down the hall?" Enla might be interested in demoting someone for that. "I'm not sure they would have announced me otherwise. I've been trying to see you for half a moon. I'm guessing I'm on some sort of blacklist." Karyne snorted. "That's nothing new. Enla isn't a fan of sailors, Thinks they're all pirates. Besides, if you've come to tell me the ship's ready, it's too late. Enla has me on a leash." He glared at the bottle of wine just out of reach on his sideboard. Larkos leaned against the desk, knocking Garen's feet to the floor.
"I'm not playing around. Ever since you told me about the priestess and the girl, strange rumors have been coming through port."
"What kind of rumors?" Garen tipped his chair and leaned precariously to grab the bottle and a glass.
"Mostly the same crazy things you told me about a dragon. The people aren't stupid. They know they're not being told the whole story, but instead of finding the truth, they're filling in the gaps with their own ideas. A few say it was the recreants, but most say it was the king keeping his people in line. Others say it's Mavis. They whisper about her being a witch, but no one says it too loud. Not after your father made her a queen."
Garen poured the wine, watching it swirl in the glass. News had traveled far faster than his father had anticipated, and yet none of it had reached Garen before now. Were they continuing to keep him out of the loop? "What about the girl?" Garen tried to keep his tone even, pushing down the terror clawing at his throat, but the effort was a waste thanks to his trembling hands. Larkos reached for the glass, which Garen passed over. Larkos downed the whole cup, not bothering to savor it the way nobles did. Garen shrugged, lifting the bottle to his lips and taking his own long swig.
"No one seems to know about the girl,"
Larkos said. Garen let his eyes drift shut. At least she had that in her favor.
"The people are riled up, including our men. A few of them had family in Islara."
Memories flooded Garen's mind, memories that didn't belong to him. Memories that belonged to mothers and fathers racing their infants to the hope of safety. Children screaming in the streets. Fire burning at their backs. He shuddered, opening his eyes to refocus on the present. The bottle of wine in his hand, the sturdy chair beneath him, the trustworthy man before him. "Why did you come, Larkos?"
"Unless someone proves it was Mavis, there's a good chance your father will take the fall. War could be at your doorstep far sooner than you expected."
"Which would turn into a bloodbath for my family." Garen set down the bottle and scrubbed his palms over his face. Larkos leaned in.
"Did you figure out why your girl is the key to exposing Mavis?"
Garen shoved down the warmth rising at the sound of "your girl." He swallowed hard, reliving Daisy's words about her magic and her blood. She wasn't the key to exposing Mavis, but she could be the key to Mavis securing more power. The band of recreants he'd found had a defensive mission, but Larkos was looking for the upper hand. "It's not my secret to share." Larkos grunted, but Garen had no idea if it was in irritation or approval.
"I'm not sure you need to share it anyway,"
the older man confessed.
"Riverin brought 20 of your men to Starspeed. They're ready to follow you across any sea for their revenge, through any barrier, to the deep and back."
A glimmer of hope stirred in Garen's chest. "I thought you said they blamed my father."
"The people blame your father because it's easy. He's right here in front of them. Your men know different. They want to get revenge on the right person. Even if they don't want a monarch, they've learned to trust their captain."
Garen blinked and looked away as his hope grew. He envisioned the ropes Enla spoke of tethering him to his men growing thicker, holding taut under the tension of impending war. "I've been a fool, Larkos. I wanted to trust the people I loved, the people I thought loved me." Larkos hummed.
"In a better world you could. You can't help who you love, but you can choose who to trust. Doesn't make you a fool for wanting someone to be both things."
"I'd rather have the trust of our men than the love of my family." The words sounded harsh to Garen's ears, but there was a freeing sensation in speaking that truth. Larkos's grin grew slowly, and he leaned forward once more, his voice low.
"You wanted to go to the old fortress in the Mindran Mountains?"
Garen's heart sped up. "Yes."
"If we sail east past Amranan's viewpoint, That would get you a 5 days' journey from the edge of the valley. Shorter if we can find horses. It would be safer to wait a moon. Those waters are best traveled on the sun's longest days. Too soon and it's treacherous.
Karyne shook his head. I can't wait that long. Larkos's eyes took on a mischievous gleam.
I never said you had to. I simply said it'd be safer. If you can be out on the veranda tomorrow night at the moon's peak, we can get you to star speed.
Karyne eyed him warily, even as his chest swelled with his hope. We'd likely be helping the recreants start a war.
Don't you see? You're finally following through. You're an official recreant.
Larkos clapped his hand on Karyne's shoulder.
War's what these boys have been waiting for. They just needed to know their captain would lead them into it.
Chapter 65. Aeliana slid off her horse's saddle, her boots sinking in the sand. The others did the same, setting up camp the same way they had for the past few weeks, every night, with the sun's sleep. The pass had taken them through a portion of the mountain range, then deposited them into an eternal marshland that hinted at the ocean to come. They'd finally made it through to North Point to stock up once more, and everyone was eager to have the swamp at their back and the beach by their side. A speck in the water grew larger, the form more human as it drew closer. A second silvery shape shadowed the first. As a wave crested, Veldon's familiar frame rode it in, the grin on his face contagious. A middle-aged Felk followed, his smile just as big, with twice the number of teeth. They each held a net full of fish, the supposed reason for their daily swim. As Veldon laughed and shot sprays of water at the others, it was clear the water was where he belonged. Aeliana took the fish, wrinkling her nose over the smell. I thought you were unbearably cheery most days, but now you make Veldon of the Forest seem positively depressed. Somehow, Veldon's grin widened as he squeezed the excess water from his trousers, his webbed fingers absorbing the drops before they fell. He grabbed a vest from his saddlebag and pulled it on, as if that tiny bit of fabric suddenly changed him from fish to human. I don't hear you complaining when you pick the flaky white flesh off those cod. It was an observation, not a complaint. They settled on the coast, pulling out their knives and starting in on the messy but rewarding work of gutting the fish. Felk attempted to help, but he found the raw fish just as tempting as the cooked, so most of what he prepared ended up in his mouth. As much as Veldon's face wrinkled with distaste over the task, he was faster than anyone else, already separating the flesh of a fish and running his knife along its backbone before Aeliana had finished slicing another one's belly. Aeliana's dagger was less suited to the job, but after taking the weapon from Karyne, she refused to use anything else. Every time she felt the groove of its hilt or caught the glimmer of the daisy on its pommel, she thought of him and the sacrifice he'd made to help them escape. It felt good to sit in her confusion over his need to protect her, even while he was supposed to hate her. The longer she wrestled with it, the more it felt like she could someday figure it out, that the opposing feelings could be parsed out and defined enough to maybe let go of the painful parts. Even Silmar had grudgingly admitted Garen's word had been true after their escape. They owed Karyne everything because he'd given them this one last chance to reach Mavis before summer solstice. What legend do I get today? Aeliana asked, not bothering to hide her eagerness. Velden wasn't as skilled of a storyteller as Jasperus, but he'd traveled farther and experienced far more, making his stories and perspective more interesting. Most of Velden's stories centered around his time in the Navy, but occasionally he'd pull out a story from the Salines, something full of history and folklore that no one else knew. "Have you heard of Lady Marinia?" he asked. "Not yet." She winced as she sliced along her own fish's bone, wondering how the two members of their party most squeamish about killing animals got stuck with this part of the food preparation. "Ah, well, when my mother last visited her family, Lady Marinia was the seer of Selah." His eyes took on his storytelling glint. "You can't believe half of what he says," Kendallin said, gathering the few fillets they'd already set aside. "I never do, but it's still fun to listen." Velden gave a mock frown, pausing to flick a stray fisheye in Eliana's direction. As Kendallin returned to the cook fire, Holm coaxed it to life. "I'll have you know that Lady Marinia is basically queen of the sailing, if the noble group ever had such a thing." Velden tilted his chin to peer down his nose at his audience. Felk raised a fish to his lips, and Velden grimaced. "Seer, priestess, queen, does the title matter if it's the same outcome?" Eliana asked. "It seems people are always looking to rule over each other." Velden shrugged. "Maybe people are always looking for someone to lead them. It doesn't always work out well, but the desire to follow a leader isn't wrong. Good leaders just happen to be rare treasures." "And I suppose Lady Marinia is one of those rare treasures?" He bobbed his head back and forth. "Yes and no. Her wisdom surpasses that of any other mortal, but she spends so much time sifting souls, examining the future, that she can't really rule the way you would expect a leader to. It's like her body remains here, but she's already left this world." Eliana raised her eyebrows, his words carrying eerie undertones that reminded her of the few things Karyne had shared about Enla. "She sounds vulnerable." Velden laughed. "She's not a dragon or Winix needing rescuing." Felk frowned, as if trying to determine whether he'd been insulted. Eliana stuck her tongue out at Velden as Holm came to collect more fillets for the fire. Cyrus sat beside them, joining in to gut more fish after caring for his and Eliana's horses. The familiar rhythm of making camp at night put Eliana at ease, allowing her to ignore the danger and unknowns they rode toward each day. "My mother went to Lady Marinia once," Velden continued. "It's a rare thing to seek out the seer, often a life or death scenario. Some return with a peace, moving forward confidently in life, affirmed by the seer. Others return with a madness, unable to speak about what they asked, why it went wrong. Some don't return at all." "She's as bad as the sprites," Cyrus muttered. "Yes," Velden said in surprise, pointing his knife at Cyrus. "Exactly. People seek her out when they reach a point of desperation. I'd like to say the outcome isn't always as terrible as it is with the sprites, but my mother made it sound like it could be far worse." "So why did she go to her?" Eliana asked, desperate to steer the conversation away from the sprites once more. Velden shrugged. "She found a silver fish that took her to a world of men and women who only have feet instead of fins, skin instead of scales." "That's when she found the Star Bridge." Eliana breathed the word out. He nodded. She was drawn to the world and its people, to one man in particular. He smiled faintly, though I'm not sure why. My father was a bit like Karyne, too sure of himself, too interested in himself. Eliana laughed, even though she no longer found the description apt. Now I know which qualities you get from your father. His good looks, for sure. Velden winked. Though my mother was a beauty, even among sailing. Reeled my father in like a siren. So Lady Marinia must have seen good things in your mother's future, Eliana said. Velden frowned. She never told me what the seer said. It's supposed to be a private affair, a bit like an awakening in that regard. Although sailing aren't as private about their awakenings as Vendarans. In Sela, an awakening is a rite of passage, celebrated with feasting and dancing. During those celebrations, Palin's waters is said to be lit so brightly the stars are drawn like moths to a flame. They still commune with the stars? Cyrus asked, sitting straighter. Velden shrugged. No more than we do, but I hear they come close enough for their individual dances to be made out in the sky. One might loop here, another might zigzag there. He let his fingers twirl around Felk's head until the Winix's eyes crossed. Eliana glanced at Aura, who managed to seem separate from the group while still being mixed in the fray of food preparation and close enough to hear Velden's story. The woman's gaze turned wistful, and she tipped her face to the sky, where it was still too early to catch the stars in their dance. Mama, Felk tugged on Eliana's sleeve. I'm going back in the water. I'll see if I can find more. She glanced down and winced at the pile of fish he'd mutilated. She supposed he should replace what he'd eaten. Have fun, Felk. He pecked a fishy kiss on her cheek before taking off down the shoreline, and she resisted the urge to tell him to be careful. He was far too old for her nagging, but the brevity of his life cycle made it hard to stop mothering him. Your mother didn't go mad from what she learned, Eliana said, steering the conversation back to the enigma of the seer. No, but still. Velden's eyes took on a distant look, his face more somber than Eliana was used to seeing. My mother chose to use the Starbridge again after speaking with Lady Marinia. She chose to marry my father and have me. I can't help wondering how much of the future she learned, how much she knew would take place. That's the thing that drives people mad, knowing too much and being unable to stop it, not knowing if it was the knowing that made it happen, or if that would have been their fate regardless. Karyne said Enla always sees multiple paths, Eliana said. That the future isn't set in stone. Velden hummed his agreement. I've heard her gift is strong, but the seer's is the strongest. The strongest even among the Saleen's history of seers. She often sees only two. The thought didn't settle well with Eliana. The idea that the future was determined regardless of her actions. Or maybe it was because of her actions. A single choice leading one direction or another. She supposed it shouldn't make a difference that the future might have one path, the same way the past only had one. But still, it bothered her. You think she saw your mother's death? Cyrus studied Velden, his brow furrowed with empathy. I don't see how she couldn't have, Velden said, and yet my mother chose that path anyway. His smile returned, but there was a sadness to it. Then it's a testament to her love for you and your father, Cyrus said, if that was the path she chose. Ever the priest, Veldin said with a laugh. Cyrus's face and ears took on a pink tinge, but Aeliana sensed he was pleased by the slight jab. They made quick work of the rest of the fish as the sun slipped past the mountains in the west. Somewhere beyond them, Karyne was probably being held prisoner in his own home, unable to join their cause, unwilling to expose them. After they rescued her mother, what would come of the Eleness and Windren families? After dinner, Silmar ran Aeliana through her regular drills. Now that they'd reached the coast, she'd have little opportunity to practice archery. Endless water and beach stretched north, east, and now west, offering little to no targets. To the south, a hill rested within a few 100 feet of the water, where the grass and minimal brush kept their horses from starving. A dozen feet farther, it was replaced by the Balric Desert, a sea of sand instead of water. Prickly trees and bushes that Aeliana couldn't identify dotted the landscape, their frames more like skeletons than foliage. It was an eerie sight, but also reassuring. Nothing would be approaching from the south, and if something miraculously did, they would see it from miles away. Healing came easier for you before we reached Eleness, when Marnock was helping, Silmar mused, studying her over Felk's fevered skin. Supposedly, the Winnocks liked being struck with various maladies, but Aeliana couldn't help wondering if Veldin's noetic secondary spoke might allow him to project contentment and make the idea more amenable to Felk. Maybe I wasn't weaned like you thought, she said. Maybe my magic gets weaker because my body still continues to normalize. Or maybe I'm not meant to heal any longer. Maybe I'm only meant to create shields. Silmar grunted, then gestured toward Felk once more. She hated practicing on anyone, but especially Felk, though she had to admit it was easier adjusting his body since his blood held no magical pull. When she'd drawn the fever from his body and sensed her magic depleting, Silmar nodded his approval. You can finish training with Lukai tonight. If you best him, I'll give you tomorrow night off. She frowned. He never made an offer without a reason. Maybe Silmar was testing her bond. Could she even injure Lukai? Did injuring him mean their bond wasn't as strong? A fire swept through her chest as Lukai approached. If Silmar was testing her bond, she wanted answers as much as he did, so she might as well play along. When Lukai pulled out his dagger, he raised a teasing eyebrow until Aeliana gripped hers as well. Lukai always told her he hoped it never came to a dagger fight, not because she wasn't formidable, but because that meant all her other lines of defense had been exhausted. She wasn't supposed to use magic, to simulate what it would be like when her magic drained and she was left to her combat skills. The problem was that her magic was so rarely drained, it was hard to pretend she knew what that weakness felt like. Silmar sat on a rock, settling with his forearms leaning on his staff to watch the show. His eyes narrowed, declaring a challenge for Aeliana. She held his gaze a moment too long. Lukai lunged, his dagger aiming low for her legs, but she knew it was a feint to get her to swipe for his head and leave her side exposed. She dove left, taking the 1 in 2 chance that she could draw first blood on his arm, but he also dove left, and her dagger met air. They danced around each other like this for several moments, their breaths growing heavy and their bodies glistening with sweat. A swim in the ocean afterward would be a nice reward for her and a treat for Felk. The distracting thought made her reaction time a hair slow, and the tip of Lukai's dagger caught her sleeve, the tiny tear almost unnoticeable. But Silmar sighed heavily, leaning on his staff to stand. Lukai and Eliana paused in indecision, but it hadn't been first blood. Eliana couldn't let that count for Silmar. She crouched low once more, and Lukai's grin returned. "That's right. Windrins never quit," he said. Silmar turned back, but Eliana didn't have a chance to evaluate his expression. She let her weight shift to the balls of her feet, dancing to the left then right, her eyes never leaving Lukai's. They remained evenly matched, drawing attention until the entire camp surrounded them, and Eliana wished she'd given up with the torn sleeve. She could practically hear Iris clucking over the split skirt slowing her down and the loosening braid becoming a liability. Finally, Lukai hesitated and glanced up. With an instinct that must have been bred into her by Lukai, Eliana remembered the tell. He stretched his leg high, his boot snapping out to connect with her dagger hand. Only her hand wasn't there. She slid beneath his raised leg, pulling him down by yanking on his other. She held her dagger at his heel to signal her ability to slice his tendon, a clear win. But his momentum kept him falling, and for some reason he didn't stop his fall with his hands. The crack of his nose hitting dirt made everyone gasp. "Lukai?" Eliana abandoned her dagger, crawling to his side to help him turn over. Blood poured from his nose, and she reeled back, automatically distancing herself from the temptation. But his face was slack, and her bond mark burned with an intensity she'd never felt before. "What did you do?" Kendallin rushed forward, pushing Eliana out of the way. Her hands settled on Lukai's face and throat, assessing the damage with practiced motions. Eliana's palm felt like fire, the pain making her already short breaths come faster and shallower. "Let me heal." "You've done enough," Kendallin said. "Please," Eliana begged. "Let her try," Silmar said. Kendallin sat back on her heels, glaring at Eliana. Blood still poured from Lukai's nose. Reassured that his heart still pumped if he bled, Eliana leaned forward, placing both hands on his temples, careful not to touch any of the blood. Her fingers itched to move closer, to draw in the power spilling out of Lukai's body. It was the most starblood she'd seen in any of her training, and it called to her with frightening clarity. It was no longer of any use to him, so why shouldn't she use it to help save him? Was it really cheating to use his own blood to heal him? She pulled back shaky hands, scanning the faces of her comrades, desperate for something to center her. Cyrus stepped forward, kneeling beside her as if he had magic to offer. "The closer you stand, the louder its call." He placed a steady hand on her arm. "Flee while it whispers, or suffer its fall. Better to die without knowing its gall." She blinked as the words tugged at her memory. Some recitation from an old holy book. "You always have a choice," Cyrus added. The weaker side of her shoved away his words. the side wanting to test the full limit of her magic. Not just the magic in her blood, but the magic she could access from someone else's. The side she still suppressed. Did the others know how hard she had to work at pushing it down? She scooted farther from Lukai. "I can't do it," she whispered. "Can't or won't?" Silmar asked. He turned from Eliana and shoved his way past Kendallin, bending forward to place a hand over Lukai's nose. A sharp crack was followed by Lukai's gasp, his eyes opening wide. His face was still a bloody mess, purple and blue bruises already forming on his face beneath the stained skin. But the flow of blood stopped, and he gave Silmar a grateful look. "You'll have to finish the rest yourself," Silmar grunted, struggling to stand. "Eliana," he called over his shoulder, "come with me." Eliana wiped her hands on her skirt, even though she hadn't touched the blood. She ignored the curious and wary looks of her companions as she walked away, her body feeling drained, even though Silmar had done the work. She followed him to the beach, the slap of his staff against sand grating on her nerves. 2 figures rose from the water, laughing and splashing. Veldin and Felk must have missed the sparring. As she and Silmar approached, Felk lifted his nose to the air before tensing in a crouch. Eliana imagined herself sniffing for blood, hating how animalistic she felt. "What happened?" Veldin asked, glancing between her and the crowd still gathered around Lukai. "I broke Lukai's nose." She meant to lighten the mood, but her voice came out flat, her mind still warring over the reaction to his blood. It had taken months, or moons, as the Vendarans liked to say, but she'd come to value what the magic in her blood could do, to see it as a gift from the stars. Only the temptation of the blood magic still tainted the gift, making it less than what it was intended to be. No matter how much she resisted it, she wasn't sure she could ever be free of its curse. Because despite the weaning process, her magic still held frightening strength compared to those around her. If she gave in to the pull of blood magic, even just once, how much damage would her magic do? Felk laughed, the vibrating tinkle in the air overriding any awkwardness from Eliana's reaction. Silmar's face remained unreadable. "You've earned your day off tomorrow. You're starting to react without thinking in combat. Now, you need to learn to do it with magic. It's time you stopped holding back." Guilt swarmed through her as he saw straight through her tactics. "I'd rather think through my choices, know if they're right or wrong before I make them, instead of having to evaluate it after." "Your situation is unique." Silmar's penetrating gaze made her wince. "I never want you to choose blood magic. But at some point, you'll need to do magic in the presence of Starblood. You can't get around it. I'd rather you tried and failed here, where it's safe. There won't always be time to think. But if you're practicing right reactions, in the moment when it matters, your reaction will be right." He patted her shoulder, then made his way back to the group, leaving Eliana more confused than before. Had she been right to hold back her magic this time? Or had fear made her pass up an opportunity? The ebb and flow of the sea should have calmed her nerves, but her body felt hungry for the blood still spilled on the ground behind her. It called to her even from this distance. Felk whined, whether because he sensed her distress or felt a similar call to the blood. "What if he's wrong?" she whispered. "What if I still make the wrong choice?" I hope you enjoyed listening to this first installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. To get reminders for new episodes and to stay up to date with my books, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at KarynNorton.com. You'll also get the prequel short story to Blood of the Stars in ebook and audio for free. Thanks so much for listening.